The morning Lillian Ashford signed away 11 years of her life, the pen felt heavier than it should have. She sat across from Garrett in the mahogany paneled conference room, the kind of room designed to make divorce feel civilized, expensive, and final. His attorney slid the last document across the table, page 43, the one that mattered. Lillian didn't read it again. She'd read it 6 times already, each reading a fresh catalogue of everything she'd lost, everything Garrett's legal team had systematically stripped away with the precision of surgeons and the mercy of accountants. The house in Greenwich, gone. The Lexus, gone. The savings account they'd built together, empty the morning he filed. She signed where his attorney pointed, her hand didn't shake. That surprised her. And the Vermont property, Garrett's lawyer said almost as an afterthought, assessed at $1 due to structural disrepair. Mrs. Ashford retains full ownership. Garrett didn't even look up from his phone. $1, her grandmother's cabin, the place Rosie had taken her that summer when she was 9, the place that smelled like cedar and old books and secrets Lillian had been too young to understand was worth, in the eyes of Connecticut family law, exactly $1. Lillian walked out of that building at 11:42 a.m. with a folder of documents, $47 in her checking account, and a property Garrett's attorneys had decided wasn't worth the paperwork. They had no idea what they'd missed. Neither did she, not yet. The morning Lillian Ashford signed away 11 years of her life, the pen felt heavier than it should have. She sat across from Garrett in the mahogany paneled conference room, the kind of room designed to make divorce feel civilized, expensive, and final. His attorney slid the last document across the table. Page 43, the one that mattered. Lillian didn't read it again. She'd read it 6 times already, each reading a fresh catalogue of everything she'd lost, everything Garrett's legal team had systematically stripped away with the precision of surgeons and the mercy of accountants. The house in Greenwich, gone. The Lexus, gone. The savings account they'd built together, emptied the morning he filed. She signed where his attorney pointed. Her hand didn't shake. That surprised her. And the Vermont property, Garrett's lawyer said almost as an afterthought, assessed it at $1 due to structural disrepair. Mrs. Ashford retains full ownership. Garrett didn't even look up from his phone. $1. Her grandmother's cabin, the place Rosie had taken her that summer when she was 9. The place that smelled like cedar and old books and secrets Lillian had been too young to understand was worth, in the eyes of Connecticut family law, exactly $1. Lillian walked out of that building at 11:42 in the morning with a folder of documents, $47 in her checking account, and a property Garrett's attorneys had decided wasn't worth the paperwork. They had no idea what they'd missed. Neither did she. Not yet. The November sky over Hartford was the specific shade of gray that New England saved for endings. Heavy clouds pressed down on the city like a lid closing on something that should have stayed open. Lillian stood on the courthouse steps and felt the cold work its way through her coat. The good coat, the one she'd bought 3 years ago when Garrett's fund had its best quarter and money felt like something that would always be there. She pulled the coat tighter and wondered how long it would last. How long before the seams gave out, before the lining tore, before she'd be standing on steps like these in something thinner, something cheaper, something that announced to the world exactly how far she'd fallen. Her phone buzzed. A text from Margot. How did it go? Lillian stared at the message. How did it go? As if there were multiple ways this could have ended, as if she'd walked into that room with options. She typed back, "It's done." 3 blocks away, in a parking garage that charged $12 an hour, sat Margot's Honda. A 2011 Civic with a dent in the passenger door and a check engine light that had been on for 8 months. Margot had lent it to her without asking questions. That was the thing about Margot Sinclair. She'd buried a husband 6 years ago, a Marine, who'd made it through 2 deployments only to die in a car accident on Route 84 coming home from work, and she'd learned that some situations didn't need questions. They needed cars and couches, and the understanding that sometimes a friend just needed someone to hand them keys and say nothing about how long they could keep them. Lillian had been sleeping on Margot's couch for 3 weeks. She drove out of Hartford as the afternoon light began its early November retreat. The route was familiar in the way that routers driven in emotional fugue states become familiar landmarks noticed without being seen, exits taken by muscle memory rather than conscious thought. Interstate 91 north, the Connecticut River on her right, moving slow and gray toward Massachusetts. The valley stretched out on both sides, hills rising in the distance, their autumn colors already faded to brown. By Northampton, the traffic thinned. By Brattleboro, she was alone on the road, just her and the same maze and the occasional pickup truck hauling equipment or livestock or the accumulated debris of rural New England lives. She thought about Garrett. She tried not to, but the mind does what it does in moments like these. It circles back, it reviews, it conducts the postmortem that the heart isn't ready for, but the brain demands anyway. They had met in 2011. She was 28, working as an investigative reporter for the Hartford Courant. He was 31, 3 years into his position at Prescott Wade Investments, already making the kind of money that turned heads at dinner parties. He'd been charming in the way that men with good haircuts and expensive watches are charming, confident, without being loud, attentive in a way that felt deliberate but not calculated. He'd asked about her work, really asked, wanted to know about the story she was chasing, the municipal corruption case she'd been digging into for 6 months. He'd listened like her work mattered, like she mattered. That should have been the tell. They married in 2013. Small ceremony. His family flew in from Boston, old money, the kind that didn't announce itself but made sure you noticed anyway. Her family was smaller. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 19. She had cousins scattered across the Midwest, people she exchanged Christmas cards with and saw at funerals. The only person she'd really wanted there was her grandmother Rosie, who'd flown in from the assisted living facility in Burlington and sat in the front row wearing a navy dress she'd owned since 1987 and a pearl necklace Lillian had never seen before. After the ceremony, Rosie had pulled her aside. "Your grandfather would have liked him," she'd said, her accent still carrying the faint edges of Polish vowels even after 70 years in America. Theo always said, "Marry someone who listens, but also marry someone who hears. They're not the same thing, Kochanie." Lillian had nodded, young and certain, and not yet aware that her grandmother's words were usually warnings disguised as blessings. 2 years into the marriage, Garrett suggested she leave the paper. He'd framed it carefully, not as a demand, but as a solution to a problem she hadn't realized they had. His career was taking off. The fund was expanding. There were dinners, events, weekends in the Hamptons with investors who needed to be courted. She was tired, he could see it, couldn't he? The long hours, the stress of chasing stories that never quite broke the way she hoped. Wouldn't it be easier if she could step back, focus on them, on the life they were building? She'd hesitated. He'd been patient, and then her editor at the Koran had killed her story, the one about the construction contracts and the city councilman's brother-in-law, and the hesitation had calcified into something that felt like surrender, but which Garrett called partnership. She left the paper in 2016. By 2020, she'd forgotten what it felt like to chase a lead. By 2022, she'd forgotten what it felt like to be certain about anything. By 2024, when she'd found the texts on his phone from a 29-year-old analyst named Simone, she'd already forgotten what it felt like to be surprised. The divorce had been efficient. That was the word his attorney kept using. Efficient. As if the dismantling of 11 years could be measured in billable hours and asset distribution schedules. He got the house, 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a kitchen. She'd renovated herself in 2019 because she'd needed a project, and Garrett had been traveling, and the alternative was admitting she'd built her entire life around a man who'd stopped seeing her somewhere around year 7. He got the car, a Lexus GS Oyster Pearl, leather interior, the kind of car that announced success in a voice that was quiet but unmistakable. He got the savings, $340,000. His attorney had a term for that too, primary earners contributed assets, as if the 8 years she'd spent not earning had contributed nothing, as if partnership was measured only in deposits. She got the furniture from the guest bedroom, a dresser, a bed frame, 2 nightstands, items that would furnish exactly half of a studio apartment if she could ever afford to rent one. She got the kitchen appliances she'd brought into the marriage, a KitchenAid mixer, a Le Creuset Dutch oven, objects that had once felt like investments in a future and now felt like receipts for a past. And she got the cabin. The lawyers had almost missed it. It had appeared on the asset disclosure list exactly once, buried in the third paragraph of the second page. Vermont property, Hardy County structure assessed at $1 transferred to Lillian Ashford née Brennan via estate of Rosaline Brennan 2013. Garrett's attorney had glanced at the line, noted the assessment, and moved on. $1 was not a number that commanded attention from men who billed $400 an hour. Lillian had said nothing. She'd learned in the long months of dissolution that silence was sometimes the smartest play, that there were moments when the only power you had was the power to withhold, to let them assume, to let them miss what mattered because they'd already decided it didn't. The cabin was hers, all of it, the structure, the land, the 4.5 acres of green mountain hillside that hadn't been surveyed since 1982 and probably contained more deer than property value. She'd signed the final papers and walked out with $47 and property worth $48 total. That was what 11 years of marriage had left her with, at least, according to the accounting that money could measure. The drive from Hartford to the cabin took 4 hours and 17 minutes. She knew because she had timed it. Not deliberately, but because time becomes elastic when you're driving toward an unknown future in a borrowed car with an overnight bag and a folder of legal documents and nothing resembling a plan. The landscape changed as she drove north. Connecticut's neat towns and highway commerce gave way to Vermont's long stretches of forests and fields. The mountains appeared gradually not as a dramatic reveal but as a slow accumulation of vertical space hills rising at the edges of the highway like memories surfacing. She took exit 2 off Interstate 89 just south of Burlington. The GPS on her phone flickered signal uncertain. She'd expected that. Cell coverage up here was more suggestion than guarantee. She pulled into a gas station, one of those combination operations that sold fuel and hunting licenses and fried chicken from a heat lamp, and unfolded the paper map she had printed before leaving Hartford. The map was old. She had found it in a box of her grandmother's things stored in Margot's basement alongside photo albums and kitchen equipment and the accumulated debris of a life that had ended 3 years ago when Rosie passed away at 94 in a memory care facility she'd insisted she didn't need. The map had been folded and refolded so many times the creases had begun to tear. Someone, probably Rosie, had marked the route in blue ballpoint pen. Interstate to exit to County Road to Secondary Road to what looked like a driveway but was labeled in careful handwriting, Private Drive 0.4 miles, grade deceiving. Lillian traced the route with her finger, committing it to memory, then refolded the map and pulled back onto the county road. 20 minutes later, the pavement ended. Not gradually, just ended, asphalt giving way to gravel with the abruptness of a decision made decades ago and never revisited. The Honda suspension registered the change immediately, the ride becoming rougher, louder, more honest about what roads actually were when you stripped away the civilization. She slowed. The gravel road curved through forest trees, pressing close on both sides. Bare branches made complicated patterns against the gray sky. November had stripped the leaves away, leaving the bones of the forest exposed. She could see deeper into the woods now, see the lay of the land, the way the ground rose and fell, the evidence of old stone walls marking property lines that nobody remembered anymore. The secondary road was marked by a sign, so faded she almost missed it. Town Road 47, unmaintained. She turned. The road narrowed, not dangerously, but enough that she became aware of the Honda's mirrors, aware of the branches that occasionally scraped against the passenger side with sounds that made her wince. She drove slowly, watching for the landmark Rosie's map had promised, and then she saw it, the split trunk oak. It stood at what must have been the original property line, a massive tree that had grown into two separate trunks from a single base. The split had happened decades ago, maybe a century, and the tree had adapted, each trunk thick and gnarled and reaching in slightly different directions, as if the tree itself couldn't decide which way to grow and had chosen both. Lillian stopped the car. She sat for a moment, engine idling, looking at the tree. Rosie had mentioned it once. That summer in 1992, the only time she'd brought Lillian up here. They'd driven past this tree, and Rosie had said something about it being a marker, a witness. Trees outlived people, she'd said. They stood watch over the things people buried and forgot. At the time, Lillian had been 9 years old and more interested in whether the cabin had a TV than in her grandmother's cryptic observations about trees. Now she was 41 and beginning to understand that Rosie's cryptic observations were usually the only map worth following. She turned onto the private drive. The gravel here was older, more settled, with grass growing up through the center. The grade was exactly as the map had warned, deceptive. It looked gentle but pulled at the Honda's engine, forcing her to give it more gas than seemed necessary. The drive curved left through the trees, climbing steadily, and then between two large oaks that had grown toward each other and almost met overhead, the cabin appeared. Lillian stopped the car and sat with the engine running, looking through the windshield at what her grandmother had left her. It was standing. That was the first thing, the first mercy. The cabin was standing, which was not guaranteed for a structure that had been sitting alone in the Vermont mountains for God knew how many years without anyone to look after it. The building was small, smaller than memory had allowed, the way things from childhood always were. A single-story structure with a steeply pitched roof, wood siding gone silver gray with age and weather. The roof was covered in moss that had spread from the edges inward in the patient way that living things claimed what they needed when no one was there to stop them. A stone chimney rose from the left side of the roof, its mortar gray and settled, its top scattered with what looked like the remains of a bird's nest abandoned before winter. Lillian turned off the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. She'd forgotten, or maybe never known, what real silence sounded like. City silence was never actually silent. There was always traffic, always voices, always the mechanical hum of civilization keeping itself running. Even Margot's neighborhood, quiet by suburban standards, had its soundtrack of distant lawn mowers and leaf blowers and the compression brakes of delivery trucks. This was different. This was the silence of a place that had been left alone long enough to forget it had ever been occupied. She got out of the car. The cold hit her immediately. Sharper here than it had been in Hartford, the mountain air carrying a bite that was specific to elevation. Cleaner, thinner, less processed by the lungs of 8 million people. She stood in the gravel drive and listened. Nothing moved. No cars on the road below, no planes overhead, no sounds from neighboring properties because there were no neighboring properties, at least none close enough to matter. According to the county parcel map she'd pulled up at the Hartford Library, the nearest occupied residence was 1.5 miles south, and that was marked as seasonal use only. Just trees and the distant sound of water somewhere below the property line and the particular silence of a place that had made peace with solitude. Lillian walked toward the cabin slowly. She wasn't afraid, not exactly, but There was something about approaching a building that had been waiting for you, a building that had known you were coming before you did, that required a certain carefulness, a respect for thresholds. The path from the drive to the front door was barely visible, more memory than fact, a slight depression in the grass where feet had walked often enough to compact the earth beneath. She found it by feel and followed it to the porch. The porch boards held. She tested each one before committing her weight, but they held, solid enough. There was a soft spot near the left railing where water had found its way in over the years, but the damage was cosmetic, not structural. The railing itself leaned outward at an angle that suggested it was functioning more as suggestion than support at this point. She held it anyway lightly and looked out from the porch at the view her grandmother had chosen this place for. It stopped her breath. The hill dropped away below the cabin in a long, gradual slope through bare trees. At the bottom of the valley, a creek ran gray and silver in the November light, winding between rocky banks before it turned at the far edge and disappeared behind a ridge. Beyond the ridge, the mountains rose in layers, each one a slightly different shade of gray and blue, fading as they got farther away until the farthest ones were barely distinguishable from the sky. The view was enormous and quiet and completely indifferent to her presence, which was, Lillian realized, exactly the point. This was not a view that needed to be earned or deserved or even appreciated. It was simply there, the way mountains were there, without condition or expectation or the need for anyone to acknowledge them. She stood on the porch for a long time, watching the light change over the valley, watching the way the clouds moved across the ridge line, watching the creek catch occasional glints of silver where the water moved over stones. Then she found the key. It was exactly where Rosie's map said it would be. On a nail under the porch railing, covered in rust but functional, Lillian unlocked the front door. The inside smelled like time. Not mustiness exactly, not the sharp smell of mold or damp, but something deeper and quieter. The smell of a space that had been sealed away from the world for years and had been slowly becoming more itself in the silence. The air was cold, colder inside than out in the particular way that old uninsulated structures trapped cold and held it. She found the light switch by feel and flipped it. The overhead light came on, a single bare bulb in a ceramic socket mounted to a ceiling beam, its light yellow and inadequate and somehow wonderful. Lillian stood in the doorway and stared at it. The power was on. She hadn't expected that. The property had been empty since Rosie went into memory care in 2018. 6 years. Who had been paying the electric bill for 6 years? She made a mental note to find out and stepped inside. The cabin was one main room, maybe 20 feet by 18. A stone fireplace on the left wall matched the chimney she'd seen from outside. The floor was white plank pine gray, with age worn in the paths that people had walked for decades. A wooden table sat in the center of the room, plain and heavy, the kind built to last rather than to be admired. 2 chairs were pushed under it. Against the far wall was a kitchen area, a cast iron stove that looked older than the cabin, a short counter, a single deep sink with a hand pump mounted above it. To the right, a doorway led to what appeared to be the only other room, small enough to be a closet, sized to be a bedroom. Everything was covered in dust. Not the casual dust of a few months, but the deep settled dust of years. It lay in layers on every horizontal surface, softening the edges of things, making the whole room feel like it existed just slightly out of focus. But nothing was destroyed, nothing had been vandalized or damaged beyond what time and weather had done on their own schedule. The walls were solid, the ceiling showed one dark stain in the far corner where a leak had let water through, but the wood around it was dry. The fireplace screen was rusted but upright. Lillian turned slowly in the center of the room, completing a full circle, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The feeling that a space belonged to her. Not because she decorated it or renovated it or made it match some image from a magazine, but because it was hers by inheritance, by blood, by the simple fact that her grandmother had chosen to leave it to her and no one else. She set her bag down on the table and began to take stock. The kitchen cabinets were three in total, rough built from pine boards and hung on hand forged hinges. The first held three mason jars of something she didn't try to identify and a stack of mismatched plates wrapped in newspaper dated 2010. The second held cleaning supplies, a bottle of vinegar, a box of baking soda, a bundle of rags tied with twine. The third held a cast iron skillet, a Dutch oven, and a long handled ladle, all coated in old grease that had gone rancid with time but which were structurally intact. She tested the hand pump over the sink. It resisted at first, the mechanism stiff from disuse. She worked the handle in long strokes, feeling the resistance gradually ease, and after maybe 30 seconds it coughed and produced a thin stream of brownish water. She kept pumping. The water cleared to pale yellow, then after 2 minutes of steady work ran cold and clear. There was a well. The well was working. Lillian cupped her hand under the stream and let it fill. The water was cold enough to hurt. She brought it to her nose. It smelled like stone and minerals and nothing chemical. She didn't drink it, not yet, not until she could get it tested, but the fact that it ran clear meant something. It meant the well hadn't collapsed. It meant the aquifer was still feeding it. It meant this place could sustain life if it needed to. She moved to the small bedroom. It held an iron bed frame with no mattress, a wooden dresser with 3 drawers, a mirror mounted above it, its silvering gone brown and cloudy with age. She opened the dresser drawers. Each side were linens folded with the precise creases of a woman who had known how to fold things properly and had done so even for objects that would sit alone in a mountain cabin for years. The sheets were yellowed but unrotted. The wool blankets were slightly moth-eaten at the corners but whole. Lillian pulled the blankets out and carried them to the porch. She shook them over the railing, watching the dust rise in a cloud and drift away down the hill. The sun was lower now, the afternoon light taking on the quality of early evening. She had maybe 2 hours before dark. She went back inside and began opening things. The cedar chest at the foot of the bed frame held more blankets. A quilt, a wool coat that had belonged to someone, probably Rosie, and which still smelled faintly of mothballs and lavender. The cabinet beside the fireplace held firewood, old wood split years ago and cured to the point of being perfectly dry. She carried an armload to the hearth and began building a fire. She'd learned how to do this as a Girl Scout. That felt like a different lifetime, a different Lillian entirely, but the knowledge was still there, buried under years of not needing it, and it came back now with the muscle memory of hands that remembered what the mind had forgotten. Kindling first, small pieces arranged in a teepee, then larger splits laid across the top. A match from the box she'd found in the kitchen drawer. The fire caught immediately. The wood was so dry it burned with almost no smoke, just clean flame that crept up the kindling and found the larger pieces and settled into the steady burn of wood that had been waiting years for exactly this purpose. The warmth spread slowly through the room. Lillian sat on the floor in front of the fire and felt the heat on her face and thought about the fact that she had shelter, she had water, she had warmth. The three things humans had needed for 10,000 years and which she'd stopped thinking about the moment she'd moved into a house with central heating and municipal water and the assumption that these things were permanent. Nothing was permanent. Garrett had taught her that, though not in the way he'd intended. She pulled her phone from her pocket and checked the signal. 1 bar, barely enough. She called Margot. You made it. Margot's voice was staticky but recognizable. I made it. And it's standing, the cabin's standing. There's power. There's water from a well. I just built a fire. Margot was quiet for a moment. You're staying. Lillian looked around the room, at the fire, at the dust, at the table and the kitchen and the doorway to the bedroom, at the view through the window where the mountains were going blue in the fading light. I don't know, she said. I need to figure out what I have here first. Be careful up there. You're alone. I know. Call me tomorrow. I will. She ended the call and sat with the phone in her hands, watching the fire, feeling the warmth and thinking about the word alone. She was alone. For the first time in 11 years, she was completely alone. No Garrett in the next room, no expectations about dinner or plans or the performance of being someone's wife. No Margot on the other side of the wall being kind enough not to mention that Lillian had been sleeping on her couch for 3 weeks. Just her and the cabin and the mountains and the silence. It should have felt frightening. It felt like breathing. She ate dinner from a can of soup she'd brought in her bag, heated on the cast iron stove after she figured out how to light it. The stove burned wood, same as the fireplace, and getting it hot enough to heat the soup took longer than she expected. But eventually the soup bubbled and she ate it straight from the pot, standing at the counter watching through the window as the last light left the valley. Full dark came at 5:30. She hadn't realized how early night arrived in the mountains in November. In the city, there was always light bleeding in from somewhere. Street lights, neighboring windows, the ambient glow of civilization refusing to fully concede to darkness. Here, dark meant dark. She lit 2 oil lamps she'd found in the cabinet and placed them on the table. Their light was warm and flickering and made shadows dance across the walls in a way that should have been unsettling but wasn't. She was tired. The kind of tired that came from driving 4 hours and processing emotions and building fires and existing in a constant state of low level adrenaline for weeks. She pulled the blankets from the cedar chest and made a bed on the floor near the fireplace. The iron bed frame in the bedroom had no mattress, and the bedroom itself was colder than the main room. She'd sleep here tonight, close to the warmth, close to the light. She lay down and pulled the blankets up and stared at the ceiling. The beams overhead were hand-hewn. She could see the marks where someone had shaped them with an axe or an adze, could see the irregularities that machine milling would have removed. This cabin had been built by hand, by someone who knew what they were doing and who had cared enough to do it right. She thought about Rosie. Her grandmother had owned this place for as long as Lillian could remember, but she'd only brought Lillian here once. That summer in 1992, Lillian had been 9. It had been just the two of them. Rosie had driven them up from Burlington in her old Buick, taking the road slowly, stopping at farm stands to buy tomatoes and corn, stopping at a small library in a town whose name Lillian couldn't remember, where Rosie had returned books and checked out new ones and spoken to the librarian like they were old friends. They'd spent 3 days at the cabin. Rosie had shown her how to pump the water, how to build a fire, how to identify the birds that came to the feeder she'd hung from the porch beam. She told stories about growing up in Poland before the war, about coming to America in 1946 with nothing but a suitcase and a sponsor letter, and the kind of determination that didn't have a name because it was just what you did when the alternative was unthinkable. She told Lillian about meeting Theodore, about falling in love with a man who'd been a soldier and then a watchmaker and then just a quiet presence in her life for 47 years until he died in 2002. And she'd said that last evening before they drove back to Burlington, sitting on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. This place is for thinking, Kochane. When you need to think, really think, not just worry, you come here, it will wait for you. Lillian had nodded, 9 years old, and not really understanding what there was to think about that required a cabin in the mountains. Now she understood. Now, lying on the floor of that cabin with $47 to her name and a marriage dissolved and a future that looked like nothing she'd planned, she understood exactly what Rosie had meant. She fell asleep to the sound of the fire settling and the wind moving through the bare trees outside. She woke to footsteps on the porch. For a moment she didn't know where she was. The room was dark except for the dim glow of coals in the fireplace. The air was cold. She was wrapped in blankets that smelled like cedar and dust, and she could hear someone walking slowly across the wooden porch boards outside. Her heart kicked into a rhythm that was trying very hard to become panic. She sat up slowly, quietly, and looked toward the door. The footsteps stopped. She held her breath. Then they started again, moving from the door toward the far end of the porch, and she heard a different sound. A snuffling sound, an animal sound, not footsteps. A deer. She let out the breath she'd been holding and felt the panic drain away and be replaced by something that was partly relief and partly the embarrassment of having been frightened by a deer. The animal moved off the porch and she heard it walking through the leaves down the hill. She lay back down and stared at the ceiling and listened to her heartbeat slow. The clock on the mantel, she hadn't noticed it before, read 4:37. Too early to get up, too awake to go back to sleep. She lay there in the gray space between night and morning and thought about what she needed to do. She needed to assess the cabin properly, check the roof from the outside, understand what repairs were critical and what could wait. She needed to figure out the well situation, whether the water was safe to drink, whether the system would hold up to regular use. She needed to understand the power situation, who was paying for it, how long it would last. She needed to make a plan. Plans were what you made when you didn't want to think about the fact that you had no idea what you were doing. The light began to change around 5:30. Not sunrise, that wouldn't come for another hour, but the specific shift that happened when night began losing its argument with morning. Lillian got up and rebuilt the fire and put water on the stove for coffee. She'd brought instant coffee in her bag. It was terrible coffee, the kind that came in a jar and dissolved in hot water and tasted like burned regret. But it was hot and it had caffeine, and those were the only requirements that mattered right now. She stood at the window with the coffee mug warming her hands and watched the valley come back to itself. The mountains appeared first, their ridge lines going from black to dark blue to the layered grays and blues she'd seen yesterday. Then the creek at the bottom of the valley, silver in the early light. Then the near trees, their bare branches resolving out of the darkness like drawings appearing on a page. By 6:15 there was enough light to see by. Lillian put on her coat, Rosie's old wool coat from the cedar chest, which fit well enough, and went outside. The morning was cold and still. Her breath made clouds in the air. The mountains were sharp against a sky that was pale and cloudless and promised a clear day. She walked the perimeter of the cabin slowly, looking up at the roof, checking the foundation where she could see it, noting places where the siding had pulled away from the frame. The roof needed attention. The moss was a problem. It held moisture, and that moisture would eventually work its way under the shingles and rot the decking beneath. But the roof wasn't actively leaking, at least not in any place she could see from the ground. The foundation was stone, old stone carefully laid, mortared with something that had held for what must be 80 years or more. There were places where the mortar had crumbled, but the overall structure was sound. The windows were swollen in their frames from moisture cycling, but they weren't broken. The porch needed work. 2 boards would need to be replaced, and the railing needed to be reset before it became a hazard. But underneath all of it, running through the assessment like a current she kept returning to, was the basic sustaining fact that the structure was sound. She could see it in the way the doors hung, slightly off from settling but not racked. She could feel it in the floors, which gave a little underfoot but didn't flex in the way that meant joists were failing. This cabin could be made livable with work, real work, the kind that required sweat and patience and no budget for contractors. But it could be done. She walked back inside and pulled the folder of divorce documents from her bag. She'd been avoiding looking at them too closely. Looking at them meant processing them, and processing them meant feeling things she wasn't ready to feel. But there were other documents in the folder too. The property transfer papers from Rosie's estate. She'd only glanced at them during the divorce proceedings, only long enough to confirm that the cabin was hers and that Garrett's attorneys couldn't touch it. Now she pulled them out and read them carefully. The transfer was dated March 2013, 6 months before her wedding. The document was simple, single page, Rosie's signature at the bottom in the small, precise handwriting Lillian remembered. Cabin and associated parcel, Green Mountains, Vermont. Transfer of title, sole ownership, Lillian Margaret Ashford, née Brennan. Beneath that, in Rosie's handwriting, a note that hadn't been part of the legal document but had been folded inside it. Kokanye, when you need a place to think, this will be waiting. The key is where I showed you. The rest you will find when you're ready. With love, always, Babchia. Babchia. Polished for grandmother. Lillian read the note 3 times. The rest you will find when you're ready. What rest? She looked around the cabin, at the table and the kitchen, and the fireplace and the bedroom door. What was there to find? The cabin was small. Simple. What you saw was what you got. Unless it wasn't. She stood up and walked slowly through the main room, looking at it differently now. Not as a space to inhabit, but as a space that might be hiding something. The walls were solid. She knocked on them. No hollow spots. The floor was white pine planks fitted tight, worn smooth by decades of feet. She walked across it slowly, listening for sounds that might indicate a loose board or a hidden compartment. Nothing. The fireplace was stone all the way up. The mantel was a single piece of wood, heavy and dark and mounted directly to the stone. No hidden drawers. The kitchen cabinets she'd already opened. She opened them again, checking the backs, looking for false panels. Nothing. The bedroom. She went into the small room and looked around the iron bed frame, the dresser, the mirror, the cedar chest. She'd already opened the cedar chest, blankets and Rosie's old coat. But she opened it again and felt along the bottom, checking for a false bottom. Nothing. She opened the dresser drawers again, linens in the top two. The bottom drawer was empty except for a small box she hadn't noticed before. She pulled it out. It was a wooden box, maybe 8 inches by 6 inches dark wood with a simple brass clasp. She opened it. Inside was a photograph. Black and white, the kind that had been developed in a dark room. The edges slightly yellowed. It showed 2 people standing in front of this cabin, a man and a woman. The man was tall, thin, wearing a suit that looked too big for him. The woman was small, dark-haired, wearing a simple dress. They were young, maybe in their 20s, and they were holding hands. Lillian turned the photograph over. Written on the back in faded ink, Theodore and Rosaline, 1952, her grandparents. She'd seen photographs of them before, but never this one. Never them this young, this unguarded. Theodore looked different than she remembered. She'd only known him as an old man already in his 70s when she was born. But here he was young and serious and looking at the camera like he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to be photographed. Rosie looked radiant. That was the word that came to mind, radiant. Not because she was smiling, she wasn't, not really, but because there was something in her expression that suggested she knew exactly how lucky she was and she wasn't going to apologize for it. Lillian sat on the floor with the photograph and felt something shift in her chest. This cabin wasn't just the structure, it was theirs. They'd stood here. They'd lived here at least for a time. They'd chosen this place. And Rosie had kept it. For 60 years she'd kept it. Through Theodore's death and her own aging and the slow accumulation of years that made most people sell off the properties that required upkeep. She'd kept it and maintained it and paid the electric bill, and eventually in 2013, when Lillian was about to marry a man who would turn out to be exactly the kind of man you needed an exit strategy for, Rosie had transferred it, not after the wedding, before, as if she'd known. Lillian put the photograph back in the box and set the box on the dresser and stood there for a long moment looking at her reflection in the cloudy mirror. She looked tired, older than 41. Her hair needed washing. She was wearing the same clothes she'd worn yesterday and the day before. But underneath the exhaustion and the unwashed hair and the borrowed coat, there was something else. Something she hadn't seen in a long time. She looked like someone who had a place to be. The bed frame sat against the wall, iron posts at each corner as springs, but no mattress. She'd need to move it eventually if she was going to stay here. Push it to a different wall, maybe to make the small room feel less cramped. She grabbed one of the posts and pulled. The frame was heavier than it looked, but it moved. She pulled it about 2 feet away from the wall, the feet scraping against the pine floor with a sound that made her teeth hurt. And then she saw it. In the floor where the bed frame had been, there was a line, not a crack, not a gap between boards. A line, cut deliberately, straight edges forming a square roughly 2 feet by 2 feet. A trapdoor. Lillian stood very still looking at it. Her first thought was root cellar. Old cabins often had root cellars, spaces beneath the floor for storing vegetables and preserved foods through winter. Her second thought was Rosie's note. The rest you will find when you're ready. She knelt beside the trapdoor and felt along the edges with her fingers. There was an iron ring set flush into the wood. She hooked her fingers through it and pulled. The door was heavy, solid wood maybe 2 inches thick, with a ledge on the underside that let it seat cleanly in the frame. But it came up smoothly. The hinges on the far side moved without protest, without the screech she'd expected from hardware that old. They'd been maintained recently. She knew this because old hinges that hadn't been used didn't move like that. They seized. They resisted. These moved like hinges that someone had oiled within the last several years. Below the trapdoor was darkness and a set of wooden steps and a smell that came up toward her in the cold morning air, not the smell of earth and vegetables, not the damp organic smell of a root cellar, something different, drier, older, the smell of a space that had been sealed and kept deliberately. Lillian sat at the edge of the opening and shined her phone's flashlight down. The steps descended maybe 8 or 9 feet into a space that was wider than a root cellar had any reason to be. She could see the edge of a wall at the bottom, stone carefully laid, not the rough fieldstone of a hasty cellar, but fitted and mortared work that matched the quality of the chimney outside. The light from her phone reached only so far. The space beyond was beyond what the flashlight could illuminate. She sat with her hand on the iron ring and felt that cautious, careful thing stir in her chest again, the thing that was not yet hope, but was moving in that direction. She thought about Rosie, about 30 years working as a librarian, about the car driven for 21 years and the shoes worn through, and the photograph of her and Theodore standing in front of this cabin in 1952, young and serious and holding hands. She thought about the note. The rest you will find when you're ready. She thought about the fact that she'd driven 4 hours to get here with $47 and no plan, and the specific desperation of a woman who had nothing left to lose. And she thought, ready or not, I'm going down. She put her phone between her teeth for the light and took hold of the top step and began to climb down into the dark. The steps were solid beneath her feet. 9 of them, each one wide enough for a full footstep and deep enough that she didn't need to grip the rough-cut railing on her right to keep her balance. She counted them as she descended the way she'd been counting everything since the divorce, measuring and cataloging and building the habit of inventory from whatever she had left. The temperature dropped as she went lower, not dramatically but noticeably. The particular cold of Earth doing what Earth always did, holding its own steady temperature regardless of what the seasons were doing above. The flashlight from her phone made a bright circle on the stone wall ahead of her and a pale radius around her feet and very little else. She reached the bottom and stood and raised her phone and swept the light slowly left to right. The space was not a root cellar. She swept the light again more slowly this time, making herself process what she was seeing rather than react to it. The room was perhaps 15 feet wide and 20 feet deep. The walls were dressed stone fitted with care. The mortar between courses was clean and gray and old. The floor was packed earth, dry, covered in several places by rough wooden boards laid as walkways. The ceiling was low enough that she could reach up and touch the floor joists of the cabin above her, visible through rough planking. A single bare bulb hung from a wire stapled along the ceiling with a pull string hanging down. She reached for it already, half certain nothing would happen. The light came on. Lillian stood in this sudden yellow brightness and looked at what her grandmother had kept below her thinking place and understood for the first time that the word thinking had been a kind of code. The walls of the room were lined with shelving, the same plain pine board construction as the kitchen cabinets above, built to the same unpretentious standard, functional, solid, built to hold weight and holding weight. She could see that from where she stood. The boards bowed slightly at their centers under what was stacked and arranged along their length. Lillian moved closer. The first section of shelving was closest to the stairs. What it held was immediately comprehensible: mason jars, dozens of them, the wide-mouthed quartz variety, but these weren't filled with tomatoes or pickled beans or summer corn, they were filled with coins. Old coins. She could see that even at a glance. The kind that came in different colors than the currency she used every day. Some with a dull copper shine, others with the particular warmth of old gold, others still in silver that had toned to gray rather than the bright finish of modern quarters. The jars were labeled in Rosie's handwriting, the small precise letters pressed into strips of masking tape affixed to each lid. Lillian traced the labels slowly with one finger, reading them like a map of time. 1890s to 1910 Morgans, 1913 to 1933 Barbers, 1878 to 1904 Trader Dollars, Indian heads, mixed dates. She didn't know coins. She had never owned a coin collection, never attended a coin show, never thought about old coins as anything other than spare change you found in jacket pockets. But she understood the weight of the jars, the deliberateness of the organization, the fact that a woman who did nothing without purpose had stored these with care and labeled them with precision. She understood that purpose and care applied to objects usually meant those objects were worth caring about. She kept moving along the shelves. The next section held something different. Flat wooden trays, perhaps a dozen of them stacked carefully with squares of felt between each one. She lifted the top tray and set it on a workbench against the far wall, a rough-built table she hadn't noticed in the first sweep, and opened the felt. Inside were stamps, postage stamps, rows of them mounted on backing paper, each one separated from the next by a layer of transparent protective sleeve. She knew even less about stamps than she knew about coins. But she could read the dates printed on them and understand that anything printed in 1869 and housed with this level of deliberate care was being treated as something precious. The stamps were small and vivid despite their age, their colors preserved in a way that normal objects 150 years old were not, because someone had understood that preservation required specific conditions and had created those conditions here in this room, in the consistent cold of a mountain hillside where temperature didn't swing and humidity didn't fluctuate the way it did in a house above ground. Lillian set the tray down and pressed both hands flat against the workbench, steadying herself. The third section of shelving held artwork. Not paintings in heavy frames, nothing she could have imagined carrying down those 9 narrow steps, but works on paper carefully interleaved with what appeared to be acid-free tissue stored flat in large shallow boxes that had been sealed at their edges with tape. She opened the top box gently, peeling the tape away carefully, and lifted one corner of the tissue. The paper beneath was cream-colored with age. The image on it was rendered in what looked like etching or engraving. A landscape, mountains in a valley, and tiny figures on a road. The kind of detail that suggested someone had spent weeks making this, had cared about every line. She didn't know the artist, didn't know what she was looking at, what period it came from, whether it was common or rare or anything in between. She only knew that it was here, in her grandmother's cellar, handled as if it mattered. There were 9 of these boxes. She opened 3 more. More prints, more etchings, different subjects, different styles, but all handled with the same meticulous care. Against the far wall, separate from the shelving, were 6 wooden crates. larger than the boxes, maybe 2 feet by 3 feet 18 inches deep. They were sealed with metal latches and looked heavy even from across the room. But what stopped her, what made her stand completely still, in the center of that underground room was the writing on the side of the first crate. Not Rosie's handwriting, different, older, European lettering that had been painted in black on the raw wood. Eigentum Familie Steiner Wien, 1938. Lillian didn't speak German, but she'd studied enough history to recognize Wien as Vienna. And the date 1938, that was the year of the Anschluss, the year Nazi Germany annexed Austria. She moved closer to the crate and ran her fingers over the painted letters. Familie Steiner, the Steiner family, property of the Steiner family, Vienna, 1938. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, making her jump. The sound was shockingly loud in the silence of the cellar. She pulled it out. A text from Margot. You okay up there? Lillian stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, found something, call you later. She put the phone away and looked around the room again, seeing it differently now. This wasn't just a collection, this was something else entirely. She climbed back up the stairs and stood in the bedroom, breathing hard, her mind racing. The cellar, the jars of coins, the stamps, the prints, and those crates with German writing from 1938. She needed to think. She went to the kitchen and made more terrible instant coffee and sat at the table and pulled out her phone. One bar of signal, barely enough. She opened the browser and searched Familie Steiner Wien, 1938. The results loaded slowly. The first few were genealogy sites, family tree databases. She scrolled past them. Then she found something from a Holocaust memorial site. Steiner family Vienna, Jewish family prominent art collectors and rare book dealers. Deported 1942, known survivors, one child Jakob Steiner born 1943 in hiding. Lillian read it 3 times. Deported 1942. She did the math. Deported meant concentration camps. Deported meant most of them didn't come back. And those crates downstairs, dated 1938, had been packed 4 years before the family was deported, 4 years before they disappeared into the machinery of the Holocaust. She set the phone down and looked out the window at the mountains, at the peaceful November morning, at the world that had no idea what she'd just found. Her grandmother had property from a Jewish family that had been murdered by the Nazis. Why, the answer she knew was somewhere in this cabin. Rosie didn't do anything by accident. She went back to the bedroom and looked through the dresser again more carefully this time. In the bottom drawer beneath the linen, she found them, journals. 6 composition notebooks, the standard black and white kind sold at every drugstore in America, arranged in chronological order according to dates written on their covers in Rosie's handwriting. The first was dated 1955. The last was dated 2019. Lillian pulled out the first one and opened it. The handwriting was Rosie's, younger and firmer than the shaky script Lillian remembered from her grandmother's later years. January 15th, 1955. Theodore finally told me the truth today about what he brought back from Germany, about what he's been keeping in the cabin all these years. I always knew there was something. The way he'd come up here alone, sometimes for days, the way he'd never let me come with him until we married. Now I understand why he waited. Lillian turned the page. He was a translator for the US Army, monuments men they called them, the unit that recovered art the Nazis stole. He was assigned to a warehouse in Munich in 1945. Thousands of items, paintings, sculptures, books, jewelry, all stolen from Jewish families. His job was to translate the ownership marks, help identify what belonged to who. She kept reading. He found the Steiner collection in a side room, packed in crates, the family name painted on the side. He made inquiries, official inquiries, but the Steiner family was gone, all of them. Father, mother, 2 older children murdered. Only one survived, a baby Jakob born in hiding in 1943, but the child had been taken to an orphanage in Prague. No one knew where he went after that. Lillian's hands were shaking. Theodore was ordered to send the Steiner property to the US Army Archives for processing. He started the paperwork, but then he found out what processing meant. It meant the items would sit in a warehouse in Maryland for years, maybe decades, maybe forever, lost in bureaucracy, while the army decided what to do with millions of stolen objects. She turned another page, turned another. He couldn't do it. He couldn't send these things into a system where they'd be forgotten. He remembered seeing Herr Steiner's name written inside one of the books. Remembered thinking this man loved these things, this man built this collection over a lifetime, and now his family is dead and his collection is about to disappear into an American warehouse where no one will ever know it existed. So he kept it. Lillian sat back against the bed frame, the journal open in her lap. Theodore had stolen it. No, not stolen, that wasn't the right word. He'd kept it, preserved it, against orders, against regulations. He'd brought it to America in 1948 when he immigrated, probably smuggled it, and he'd hidden it here in this cabin, and he'd waited for what she kept reading. Theodore said he always planned to find Jakob Steiner, to return everything to him. It was the only honorable thing to do, but he couldn't find him. He tried for years, wrote letters to refugee organizations, to the Red Cross, to synagogues in Prague and Vienna and New York. No one knew where Jakob Steiner had gone. The trail went cold in 1949. So Theodore kept looking, and while he looked, he kept the collection safe. He maintained it, preserved it, treated it with the care that Herr Steiner would have wanted, because even though he couldn't return it, he could make sure it wasn't lost. The entry ended there. Lillian sat in the cold bedroom with her grandmother's journal and felt the weight of what she'd found settle into her bones. This wasn't a treasure. This was a trust. A 76-year-old trust that her grandfather had taken on and her grandmother had maintained, and that had now somehow landed in her lap. She pulled out her phone and searched Jakob Steiner, Holocaust survivor. The signal was weak, the results slow to load, but eventually something came through. A faculty page from a university in California. Department of History, Professor Jakob Steiner, Emeritus Specialist in Holocaust Studies and Art Restitution, age 81, still alive. Lillian's phone buzzed again. This time it was a call, not a text. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. But something made her pick up. Hello, is this Lillian Ashford? A man's voice, older, rough around the edges. Yes, who is this Colton? Colton Ashford. We're cousins, second cousins technically. Your grandmother Rosie and my father were siblings. Lillian's mind went blank for a second, then started racing. Rosie had a brother. She'd mentioned him maybe twice in all the years Lillian had known her. She died when Lillian was in college and they'd lost touch, and she'd never thought to ask. How did you get my number? Called around, found a lawyer named Sinclair who said you might be at the cabin, said it was urgent. I talked to you. Margot gave you my number. She said you'd want to know about the inheritance, about what Rosie left. Lillian felt her chest tighten. What do you mean? My father died 6 years ago. Before he passed it, he told me that Rosie had something she was keeping at the cabin in Vermont, something that was supposed to be for family. I didn't think much of it at the time. Dad said a lot of things those last few months. But then I got a letter from a lawyer last week saying Rosie had passed and the estate was settled and you got the cabin. That's right, I did. Well, that's the thing. Colton's voice got quieter. My dad said Rosie promised him if anything happened to her, the family would be taken care of. He said there was something valuable at the cabin, something she'd been holding on to for years. Lillian looked at the open trapdoor, at the stairs going down into the cellar. I don't know what you're talking about, she said carefully. I think you do. Colton wasn't aggressive, just tired. Look, I'm not trying to cause problems, but my dad died owing $165,000 in medical bills. Cancer treatment. He didn't have insurance the last 2 years. I've been trying to pay it off, but I lost my house last year. I'm living in a trailer in Rutland. I just need enough to cover the debt and maybe buy a small place. That's it. I'm not asking for half of everything, just enough to honor what Rosie promised my dad. Where are you now? About 2 hours away. I can be there this afternoon if you want to talk in person. Lillian's mind was spinning. She didn't know this man, didn't know if what he was saying was true, didn't know if Rosie had made any promises to his father or if this was just someone who'd heard rumors and was trying to cash in. But she also didn't know what was actually in those crates downstairs. Didn't know if they contained anything valuable or if they were just old books and papers that belonged to a murdered family and shouldn't belong to anyone. Okay, she said, come this afternoon, we'll talk. Thank you. Colton sounded genuinely relieved. I'll be there around 2. He hung up. Lillian sat with the phone in her hand and stared at nothing. A cousin she'd never met was coming to claim part of an inheritance she didn't understand from a grandmother who'd apparently been keeping secrets for 70 years. She needed help. She called Margot. Did you give my number to someone named Colton Ashford? I did. Margot didn't sound apologetic. He called here looking for you, said he was family, said it was about Rosie's estate. I figured you'd want to know. You could have asked me first. I could have, but he sounded desperate, Lil. Not scammer desperate, real desperate. I've heard enough of both to know the difference. Lillian closed her eyes. He's coming here this afternoon. Good, hear him out. If he's lying, you'll know. If he's telling the truth, you'll know that too. There's something else? Lillian looked at the open trapdoor again. I found something in the cabin. Under the floor? A cellar. It's full of things, old things. Coins and stamps and artwork and crates with German writing from 1938. Margot was quiet for a long moment. German writing from 1938? Yeah, that's not good, Lil. I know. You need to call someone, an expert, someone who knows what you're dealing with. I found journals, Rosie's journals. She wrote about it, about how Theodore got these things. He was a translator for the US Army. Monuments man, he found a property that belonged to a Jewish family that was murdered in the Holocaust. He was supposed to send it to Army archives, but he kept it instead. He was trying to find the family, trying to return it. But he couldn't find anyone. Jesus. There's a survivor. I found him online. Jakob Steiner. He's a professor in California. He's 81. You need to call him. I know, but I don't know what to say. Hi, I'm calling because my grandfather stole your family's property 76 years ago and kept it in a cabin in Vermont. How do you make that call? You make it honestly. You tell him the truth. Lillian knew Margot was right. But the thought of making that call, of opening that door, made her feel sick. Because once she called Jakob Steiner, once she told him what she'd found, everything would change. The property wouldn't be hers anymore. It would be his, legally, morally, in every way that mattered. And she'd be back to having nothing. $47 and a cabin with an empty cellar. I'll think about it, she said. Don't think too long. You've got a cousin showing up in a few hours who thinks he has a claim. And you've got property that might belong to someone else entirely. This is going to get complicated fast. I know. She ended the call and sat in the silence of the cabin, listening to the wind in the trees outside. Colton Ashford arrived at 2:15. Lillian heard the truck before she saw it, a diesel engine laboring up the grade, the sound echoing through the trees. She was standing on the porch when he pulled into the drive. The truck was old. A Chevy from the 90s, rust showing through the wheel wells, a crack across the windshield. It stopped and the engine cut off, and for a moment there was just silence. Then the door opened and Colton got out. He was 58 but looked older, thin in the way that spoke of meals skipped rather than exercise. His hair was gray, cut short, military style. He wore jeans and a work jacket and boots that had seen serious use. But it was his hands that Lillian noticed first. The left hand was scarred, badly. Burns, she thought, old burns that had healed rough and tight, leaving the skin discolored and the fingers slightly curled. He saw her looking and pulled the hand into his pocket. Lillian, Colton. They stood looking at each other across the gravel drive. He had Rosie's eyes. That was the thing that struck her. The same pale blue, the same way of looking at you like he was reading something written just behind your face. Thanks for seeing me, he said. You said it was urgent. It is, for me anyway. He looked at the cabin, then back at her. Can we talk inside? She led him in. He stood in the main room, taking it in. The fireplace, the table, the kitchen. His eyes moved over everything with the attention of someone who was cataloging or remembering or both. I was here once, he said, when I was a kid, maybe 7 or 8. My dad brought me up. Rosie was here. She made us lunch, sandwiches and soup. I remember thinking it was the quietest place I'd ever been. It still is. He nodded. My dad and Rosie didn't talk much after that. I never knew why. Family stuff, I guess. People drift apart. Lillian gestured to the table. Sit. They sat across from each other, the same table where Rosie had sat, where Theodore had sat, where 70 years of quiet family history had accumulated. Tell me about the promise, Lillian said. Colton pulled his scarred hand out of his pocket and set it on the table. He looked at it for a moment, then at her. I was in the Gulf War, first one, 1990 to 91, Marines. I was a vehicle mechanic. We were in Kuwait when an ammunition truck caught fire. I was trying to disconnect the fuel line when it went up, burned my hand pretty bad. Got me a medical discharge and a disability check that doesn't cover much. He paused. After I got out, I worked construction. Did okay for a while, got married, had 2 kids. Then the marriage fell apart and the construction work dried up and I started drinking more than I should. By 2015, I was doing carpentry work out of my garage, barely making rent. My dad got sick in 2016, stage 4 lung cancer. He'd smoked for 50 years, so nobody was surprised. He didn't have much insurance. Medicaid covered some of it, but not the treatments he wanted to try, not the experimental stuff. He asked me for help and I gave him what I could, but it wasn't enough. He called Rosie. She was in her 90s by then, living in that memory care place in Burlington. He visited her and they talked. He came back and said she'd promised to help. Said when she passed there'd be something for the family, something she'd been holding on to. He said not to worry about the medical bills, that they'd be covered when the time came. Did he say what it was specifically? No, just that there was something at the cabin, something valuable. He said Rosie told him it was complicated, but that she'd made arrangements. Did you believe him? Colton looked at her steadily. My dad said a lot of things those last few months. The morphine made him confused. So honestly, I didn't know what to believe. But he said it more than once. And he said it when he was lucid. So yeah, I believed enough to come looking when I heard you'd inherited the cabin. Lillian watched his face. He wasn't lying. She'd interviewed enough people as a reporter to know when someone was manufacturing a story and when they were telling the truth, however incomplete. How much do you owe? 165,000, give or take. And what are you asking for? Enough to cover that. And maybe enough to buy a small place. Nothing fancy, just something I own. I'm tired of landlords and trailers and moving every time the rent goes up. He paused. I'm not asking for half. I'm not even asking for a quarter. Just enough to get square. Lillian nodded slowly. I need to show you something. She led him to the bedroom. The trapdoor was still open. She'd left it that way, hadn't been able to bring herself to close it again. Colton looked down into the cellar, then at her. What is that? That's what Rosie was keeping. Come on. They went down together. Colton stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked around the room exactly the way Lillian had. The slow sweep of eyes trying to process what they were seeing. Holy hell, he said quietly. Yeah. He walked to the shelves, looked at the mason jars of coins, picked one up, held it to the light, set it down carefully. Are these real? I think so. He moved to the stamp trays, opened one, stared at it, closed it again. Then he saw the crates. He walked over to them slowly and read the painted German lettering. What does this mean? Property of the Steiner family, Vienna, 1938. He looked at her. Who were the Steiners? A Jewish family, art collectors and book dealers. They were deported in 1942, murdered in the camps. Only one survived. A baby named Jakob. Colton stood very still. And their property is here in this cellar. Yes, how she told him about Theodore, about the monuments man, about the warehouse in Munich, and the decision Theodore had made to keep the Steiner collection rather than send it into the bureaucracy of the US Army archives. Colton listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat down on one of the wooden crates and put his head in his hands. So none of this is actually ours. I don't know. Legally, it's complicated. Theodore brought it to America. He kept it for 76 years. Rosie inherited it when he died and she maintained it. She left it to me. But morally, it belongs to Jakob Steiner. Yeah. Colton looked up at her. Does Jakob Steiner know his family's property is here? No, not yet. Are you going to tell him? Lillian sat down on another crate facing him. I don't know. I only found this yesterday. I only read Rosie's journals this morning. I only found out Jakob Steiner was still alive about 3 hours ago. If you tell him, he'll want it back. And he should have it back. It's his. I know. But if he gets it back, there's nothing left for us. Nothing to pay my dad's debts. Nothing to get you back on your feet. I know that too. They sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Colton said, What do you think it's worth? All of it. I have no idea. I'd need experts to even begin to estimate. But old coins, old stamps, artwork from a prominent Viennese family in 1938, it could be substantial. Millions. Maybe. Colton laughed. It was a short, bitter sound. My dad died thinking Rosie was going to save me. And she did. She left something worth millions. Except it's not actually ours to keep. Lillian looked around the cellar at the shelves and the crates and the careful preservation of 76 years of waiting. I think Rosie knew, she said. I think she knew it belonged to the Steiners. I think that's why she never sold it, never touched it. She was waiting for the right time, waiting for someone in the family to be ready to do the right thing. You think that someone is you. I think that someone is us. Colton looked at her. What do you mean? I mean, we call Jakob Steiner, we tell him what we found, we offer to return his family's property, and we do it together, his family. And the debts, the medical bills, we figure it out, we find another way. Colton stood up and walked to the far wall. He stood there with his back to her for a long time. When he turned around, his eyes were wet. I was in a bad place when I came here, he said. Real bad. I thought this was my last shot. Thought if I could just get enough money to clear the debts and buy a place, I could start over, build something. You still can. With what I told you, what I've got, it's nothing. You've got skills. You said you do carpentry. Yeah, when I can find work. This cabin needs work, roof repair, porch boards, window frames. If I'm going to stay here, I need it livable. I can't pay you much. I don't have much, but I can pay something. And you can stay here while you work. There's a wood stove in the bedroom. It's cold, but it's dry. Colton stared at her. You do that, let me stay. Even though I came here trying to claim part of an inheritance that isn't mine, you came here trying to honor your father. That's not the same thing. He wiped his eyes with his good hand. I don't know what to say. Say you'll help me fix this place, and say you'll back me up when I call Jakob Steiner, because I'm going to need someone to confirm I'm not making this up. Colton nodded slowly. Okay. Yeah, I can do that. They climbed back up into the cabin. The afternoon light was starting to fade. The mountains outside the window were going blue at their edges. Lillian made coffee, the terrible instant kind, and they sat at the table and she pulled out her phone. She'd saved the number for Jakob Steiner from the university website. Her finger hovered over the call button. You ready for this? Colton asked. No? Me neither. She pressed the button. The phone rang 4 times. She was about to hang up when someone answered. Hello, an older man's voice, slight accent, European vowels. Is this Professor Jakob Steiner? Yes. Who is calling, please? My name is Lillian Ashford. You don't know me, but I'm calling about property that belonged to your family. Property from Vienna, from 1938. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then what property items that were packed in crates labeled with your family name, Eigentumfamilie Steiner Wien 1938. Another silence, longer this time. When Jakob Steiner spoke again, his voice was shaking. Where are you? Vermont. I'm at a cabin in Vermont. The property is here. It's been here since 1948. How did you... He stopped, started again. How did you come to have my family's property? It's a long story, but the short version is that my grandfather was a translator for the US Army Monuments Man. He found your family's collection in Munich in 1945. He was supposed to send it to Army Archives, but he kept it instead. He was trying to find survivors, trying to return it, but he couldn't find anyone, so he brought it to America and he kept it safe. And when he died, my grandmother maintained it, and now she's gone, and I found it, and I found you. She could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. What is in these crates? He asked finally. I haven't opened them yet. I wanted to call you first, but there are other things here. Coins, stamps, prints, all carefully preserved. My grandfather collected coins, Jakob said quietly. My grandmother collected stamps. They had a bookshop in Vienna. They love beautiful things. Lillian felt something break open in her chest. Professor Steiner, I want to return your family's property to you. All of it. I don't know what the legal process is. I don't know how long it will take, but I want you to have what belongs to you. There was a long pause. Then Jakob Steiner said, May I come see it? I am 81 years old and I do not travel well anymore, but I would very much like to see what my family left behind. Of course, whenever you're ready. I will make arrangements. I will call you back with the details. But Miss Ashford, yes, thank you for calling, for preserving these things, for doing what is right, even though you do not have to. My grandfather started it. I am just finishing it. Your grandfather was a good man. I think he tried to be. They said goodbye and she ended the call. Colton was looking at her across the table. You really did it, he said. Yeah? How do you feel? Lillian looked around the cabin, at the fire burning low in the hearth, at the table and the kitchen and the view through the window where the last light was leaving the valley. I feel like I just gave away millions of dollars, she said. Did you though? Well, what do you mean? I mean, was it ever really yours to give away, or were you just the person who was supposed to find it and pass it on? Lillian thought about that, about Rosie's note, about Theodore's decision in that warehouse in Munich, about 76 years of careful preservation and waiting. I think you're right, she said. I think I was just the messenger. Well, Colton said, at least you delivered the message. They sat in silence as the light faded and the cabin settled into evening around them. Outside, the mountains held their shape against the darkening sky, and somewhere in California, an 81-year-old man who had been born in hiding and raised as an orphan was learning that his family had left something behind after all. And in Vermont, in a cabin worth $1, two cousins who had never met before today sat together and understood that sometimes the most valuable thing you can inherit is the chance to do something right. Jakob Steiner arrived on a Tuesday morning in early December, 3 weeks after Lillian's phone call. She'd spent those weeks in a strange limbo of waiting and working. Colton had moved into the cabin the day after their conversation, setting up a sleeping area in the main room near the fireplace and starting on the repairs. He worked methodically the way a man works when he's grateful for the distraction. New boards on the porch, window frames planed and sealed, the worst section of roof patched and reshingled. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire and talk. Colton told her about the Gulf War, about the fire that had taken his hand, about the years after when he'd tried to build a normal life and failed in all the quiet ways that men failed when they came back changed. Lillian told him about Garrett, about the slow erosion of a marriage, about the specific loneliness of living with someone who'd stopped seeing you. They didn't talk much about what was in the cellar. That felt like something that needed to wait for Jacob. Margot had called twice with the name of a lawyer. Augustus Whitmore, she'd said, used to work for the FBI art crime team. Retired now, but he consults on restitution cases. If anyone can help you navigate this, it's him. Lillian had called Wetmore. He'd listened to her story without interrupting, then said he'd come up after Jacob's visit. Let the man see what his family left first, Whitmore had said. Then we'll figure out the legal path forward. Now Jacob was here. Lillian watched from the porch as the car came up the drive. A sedan, dark blue, moving carefully over the gravel. It stopped and the engine cut off, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the passenger door opened and a man emerged. He was small. That was the first thing she noticed. Small and thin in the way of old men who'd been thin their entire lives. He wore a heavy coat and a scarf despite the car's heater, and he moved slowly, one hand on the car door for balance. The driver, a younger man, maybe 40, came around to help, but Jacob waved him off with a gesture that was more habit than irritation. He looked up at the cabin, then at Lillian, standing on the porch. Their eyes met. Lillian came down the steps. Professor Steiner, Miss Ashford. His accent was slight but present, German vowels softened by decades of English. Thank you for allowing me to come. Of course. Please come inside. She helped him up the porch steps. He moved carefully but with dignity, refusing to lean on her more than necessary. Colton had built up the fire and made coffee. He stood when they entered, his scarred hand self-consciously in his pocket. Professor Steiner, this is Colton Ashford, my cousin. He's been helping with the cabin. Jacob nodded to him. You are also family to the woman who kept these things safe. Yes, sir. Rosie was my aunt. Then I am in your debt as well. The driver had carried in a leather satchel and set it by the door. Jacob gestured to him. This is my grandson Daniel. He was kind enough to drive me from Boston. We flew in yesterday. Daniel Steiner was tall, where his grandfather was small, broad, where Jacob was thin. He had his grandfather's eyes, though dark and careful. Would you like coffee? Lillian asked. Or would you rather see the collection first? Jacob smiled. It was a sad smile. I have waited 76 years. I think I can wait for coffee. They sat at the table. Lillian poured coffee into mismatched mugs and they talked around the thing they were all there to discuss. Jacob told them about his childhood, about being born in a hidden room in Prague in 1943, about learning when he was 7 that his parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles had all been murdered, about being raised by strangers in a Catholic orphanage where he'd hidden his Jewish name and learned to forget where he came from. I did not know I was Jakob Steiner until I was 18, he said. The nuns called me Jan Novak. That was the name on my false papers. When I left the orphanage, I went to university. I studied history because I wanted to understand what had happened to my family. And eventually I found records, deportation lists, my father's name, my grandmother's name, all of them gone to Auschwitz or Treblinka or Sobibor. He paused, looking into his coffee. I learned that my grandfather had owned a bookshop in Vienna, that he collected rare books and manuscripts, that my grandmother collected stamps and coins, that they had built something beautiful over 40 years. And then in one night in 1938, after the Anschluss, the Nazis came and took it all, packed it into crates and sent it to warehouses in Munich and Berlin. I spent 30 years searching for any trace of what they had owned. I found nothing. The Nazis were very efficient at making things disappear. I assumed everything was destroyed or sold or lost in the chaos after the war. He looked at Lillian. And then you called. I'm sorry it took so long, Lillian said. You are not responsible for the delay. You were not even born. You are responsible only for the honesty, for calling me instead of selling these things or keeping them hidden. That kind of honesty is rare. My grandfather wanted to return them. He tried to find you. I'm sure he did, but I was hidden very well, perhaps too well. Jacob set down his coffee cup. May I see them now? Lillian led him to the bedroom. The trapdoor was closed, but the bed frame was pushed aside ready. It's down below, she said. Yeah, the stairs are steep. Do you need help? I will manage. Colton went first, then Jacob, moving carefully, one hand on the railing. Daniel followed close behind his grandfather, ready to catch him if he stumbled. Lillian came last. When Jacob reached the bottom and saw the room, he stopped. He stood very still, looking at the shelves and the crates and the careful organization of 76 years of preservation. Then he began to cry. Not loudly, just tears running down his face while he stood there looking at what his family had left behind. Daniel put a hand on his grandfather's shoulder but said nothing. After a long moment, Jacob walked to the shelves. He looked at the mason jars labeled in Rosie's handwriting. He opened one carefully and poured a few coins into his palm. My grandfather's, he said quietly, and I recognized the dates he would have collected. 1890s, 1900s. He loved American coins. He had a client in New York who sent them to him. He put the coins back and moved to the stamp trays. He opened one, stared at it, closed it again. My grandmother's, she collected since she was a girl. These are Austrian issues. Here, he pointed to a row of stamps. These are from 1918, just after the empire fell. She loved these because they showed the new borders, the new countries. She said they were maps of change. He moved to the boxes of prints. He didn't open them, just read the labels Rosie had written and nodded as if confirming something he'd already known. Then he turned to the crates. The 6 wooden crates with the painted German lettering. He walked to the first one and ran his fingers over the words his grandfather had painted 86 years ago. Eigentum Familie Steiner, Wien, 1938. He stood there for a long time with his hand on the crate, not moving, barely breathing. Finally he said, May I open them? Of course, Lillian said. They're yours. Jacob knelt slowly. Daniel moved to help him, but he waved him off. The latch was stiff, but it opened. Jacob lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and then in layers of tissue paper that had yellowed with age, were books. Old books, leather bindings, gold lettering on the spines. Jacob lifted one out, carefully unwrapped it, and opened to the first page. He read the inscription there, and his hands began to shake. This was my grandfather's, he said. His name is here. Stefan Steiner in 1902. This was in his shop in the rare books room. He set it down carefully and lifted another and another. Each one he unwrapped, each one he confirmed, each one made him cry a little more. By the time he had opened all 6 crates, he was sitting on the floor, surrounded by books and manuscripts and rolled documents that his grandparents had collected over a lifetime and had packed hastily in 1938 when they understood that everything was about to be taken from them. They tried to save it, Jacob said. They knew what was coming. Everyone knew by 1938, so they packed what they could and they hid it or sent it away or buried it. And somehow these crates ended up in a warehouse in Munich where your grandfather found them. He looked up at Lillian. You said he tried to find me, to return these. Yes. For years he wrote letters to refugee organizations, to the Red Cross, to synagogues, but he couldn't find you. So he kept them safe. He brought them to America and he kept them safe. Yes. And your grandmother continued after he died. Yes. Jacob nodded slowly. They were good people, your grandparents. They did not have to do this. They could have sold these things or turned them over to authorities and forgotten about them, but they did not. They kept them. They waited. They trusted that someday the right person would come. He stood slowly, Daniel helping him up. Miss Ashford, I would like to make you an offer. Lillian felt her chest tighten. An offer? Yes. These items are legally mine. The law is clear on that. Stolen property, even property stolen 86 years ago, belongs to the original owners or their heirs. Any lawyer will tell you this. I know. But morally, the situation is more complex. Your grandfather saved these things from being lost forever. Your grandmother preserved them. You found them and called me instead of keeping them hidden. That kind of stewardship deserves recognition. You don't owe me anything. Perhaps not legally, but morally I do. He walked back to the crates, looked at them for a moment, then turned to face her. I would like to donate certain items to museums. The manuscripts, the most significant books, too, of the paintings I saw in those boxes. These belong in institutions where they can be studied and appreciated. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has already expressed interest. That sounds right. The remaining items, the coins, the stamps, some of the prints and books, these I would like to sell through proper channels with authentication and provenance documentation. I estimate this will take 6 to 8 months and the proceeds will be substantial. He paused. I would like to divide those proceeds in the following way: 50% to me to establish a foundation in my family's name for Holocaust education, 30% to the Monuments Men Foundation to honor the work your grandfather did, and 20% to you and your cousin in recognition of your family's stewardship. Lillian stared at him. You want to give us 20%? I want to give you what is fair, what my family would have wanted me to give. We were not people who hoarded, we were people who shared. My grandparents' bookshop was a gathering place. They lent books to students who could not afford them. They gave away knowledge freely. I think they would approve of this division. But that could be. Lillian stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Substantial, Jacob said. Yes. The preliminary estimates I have received suggest the sellable portion of the collection is worth between $2.5 and $3 million. 20% of that would be $500,000 to $600,000. Colton made a sound. Lillian looked at him. His face had gone white. That's enough, Colton said quietly, and that's enough to pay the medical bills and buy a house and have something left over. Jacob looked at him. You have debts? My father died owing money, a lot of money. I've been trying to pay it. Then this will help, and perhaps, Jacob paused, perhaps you will use some of it to honor your father, your aunt, the people who kept my family's memory alive. Lillian felt tears on her face and didn't bother to wipe them away. Professor Steiner, I don't know what to say. Say you will accept. Say you will help me with the logistics of this process. And say you will allow me to visit this cabin again someday, because I find I would like to return to the place where my family's things waited for me. Yes, Lillian said, to all of it. Jacob smiled. It was the first real smile she'd seen from him. Good, then we have an agreement. They climbed back up to the cabin and Jacob sat by the fire while Daniel went out to the car to make phone calls. Calls to lawyers and museums and the organizations that handle this kind of restitution. Lillian made lunch. Soup and bread. They ate together at the table and Jacob told them more about his grandparents, about Stefan, who could identify a first edition from across the room, about Anna, who could tell you the country of origin of any stamp just by looking at the perforations, about their apartment in Vienna that had been filled with books and music and the smell of coffee and the constant stream of artists and writers and students who came to the shop. They built something beautiful, Jacob said, and then it was destroyed, but not completely, because of your grandfather, because of your grandmother, because of you. A piece of it survived. That is no small thing. In the afternoon, Augustus Whitmore arrived. He was in his early 70s, tall and lean, with the kind of face that had seen a lot and decided most of it wasn't worth commenting on. He wore a wool coat and carried a leather case, and he shook hands like a man who meant it. Professor Steiner, I have read your work on art restitution. It's foundational. You are too kind. I'm accurate. Whitmore turned to Lillian. You did the right thing calling immediately, saved everyone a lot of legal headaches. I didn't know what else to do. Most people would have tried to keep it quiet, sell it quietly, hope no one noticed. You didn't. That matters. They spent the next 3 hours going through the logistics. Whitmore explained the legal framework, the Washington Principles on Nazi-confiscated art, the HEAR Act that extended the statute of limitations on Holocaust art claims, The process of authentication and provenance research that would need to happen before anything could be sold. We're looking at 6 to 8 months minimum, he said, possibly longer if any of the items require international documentation. But Professor Steiner's proposed division is legally sound. Courts favor negotiated settlements in restitution cases, especially when both parties are acting in good faith. What about taxes? Colton asked. You'll pay capital gains on your portion, but there are ways to structure it that minimize the burden. I'll connect you with a good tax attorney. By evening, they had a plan. Whitmore would coordinate with the auction houses and museums. Jacob would provide family documentation and work with Holocaust restitution organizations to establish provenance. Lillian and Colton would maintain the collection in place until the authentication process was complete. This cabin becomes the temporary repository, Whitmore said. We'll need security, insurance, climate control for the cellar. How much will that cost? Lillian asked. I'll cover it, Jacob said. Consider it payment for storage. Before he left, Jacob asked to go back down to the cellar one more time. Lillian went with him. They stood in the yellow light of the bare bulbs, surrounded by the careful preservation of 76 years. I have a question, Jacob said. Did your grandmother leave you anything else? Any letter? Any explanation for why she kept these things? Just a note. It said the rest you will find when you're ready. She was a wise woman. I'm beginning to understand that. Jacob walked to one of the crates and put his hand on it again. When I was a boy in the orphanage, the nuns told me my family was gone, that they had left nothing behind, that I should forget them and make a new life. I tried. For many years I tried. He turned to look at her. But you cannot forget people who loved you, even if you never knew them. You carry them anyway. In your blood, in your bones, in the questions you ask. I have carried my family my entire life without ever holding anything they touched. He gestured to the room. Now I can hold these. Now I can open these books and see my grandfather's handwriting in the margins. Now I can touch these stamps my grandmother collected. Now I can prove to myself that they were real, that they existed, that they mattered. His voice broke. You gave me that. You and your grandfather and your grandmother, you gave me proof that my family was real. Lillian couldn't speak. She just nodded. They stood there together for a long moment, an old man who had survived everything and a middle-aged woman who had lost almost everything, connected by the careful preservation of people who had understood that the most important things you could pass down weren't objects, but the chance to do right by them. Jacob left the next morning. Before he got in the car, he took Lillian's hands in his. I will return in the spring, he said, when the authentication is complete, when we are ready to begin the sales. I would like to see this place when it is green. I'll be here. Good. And Miss Ashford, Lillian, please. Lillian, thank you for giving me my family back. She watched the car go down the drive and disappear into the trees. When she turned around, Colton was standing on the porch. We did it, he said. Yeah. $500,000 to $600,000. Yeah. That's going to change everything. I know. They stood there looking at each other. What are you going to do with your half? Colton asked. I don't know yet. Pay off some debts, fix this place properly, maybe buy it some land around it so it stays protected, maybe start something. I used to be a reporter. Maybe there's a way back to that. And the cabin. I think I'll keep it. I think Rosie wanted me to have a place to think. Turns out I need that. Colton nodded. I'm going to pay off my dad's medical bills first, every cent. Then I'm going to buy a house. Nothing fancy. Just something with a workshop where I can do carpentry. Maybe build furniture. Maybe teach kids who want to learn. That sounds good. And I'm going to visit my dad's grave and tell him that Rosie kept her promise, that the family was taken care of. Lillian felt her throat tighten. He'd like that. They went inside. Over the next several months, the cabin became something Lillian hadn't expected, a home Colton finished the repairs and then kept going, building proper shelving and fixing the kitchen and installing a small wood stove that heated more efficiently than the fireplace. He slept in the main room and worked during the day, and slowly, gradually, the haunted look in his eyes began to fade. They fell into a rhythm. Lillian would drive to town twice a week for supplies and to use the library's internet. She'd started writing again, pitching articles to magazines and newspapers about restitution, about found history, about the quiet ways that ordinary people preserved extraordinary things. Two of the pieces sold. The money wasn't much, but it was hers, and it felt like proof that she could still do the work she'd trained for. In January, a security system was installed in the cabin. In February, climate-controlled equipment went into the cellar. In March, the first authentication teams arrived, specialists in numismatics and philately and rare books who spent days examining and documenting every item. Jakob called once a week. He'd started writing a book about his family and the collection. He read passages to her over the phone, descriptions of his grandfather's bookshop and his grandmother's stamp room and the life they'd built in Vienna before it was destroyed. You are in the book, he told her. You and your grandparents, you are part of the story of how these things survived. I'm honored. It is I who am honored to have found you, to have found people who understood what honor means. In April, on a morning when the last snow was melting and the first green was showing on the hills, Lillian's phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Hello. Lillian, it's Garrett. She felt her whole body go cold. How did you get this number? I called around. Look, I heard something. About you and some kind of inheritance? About a collection worth millions. I wanted to know. Know what? No to whatever you're about to say. No to whatever you're about to ask. No to you calling me. I just thought you thought wrong. We're divorced, Garrett. You made sure of that. You made sure I walked away with $47 in a cabin you thought was worthless. You made sure I had nothing. I didn't know about the collection. Exactly. You didn't know because you never asked. You never cared enough to ask what mattered to me or where I came from or what my grandmother might have left me. You saw a property assessed at $1 and you moved on because $1 wasn't worth your attention. That's not fair. Fair? You want to talk about fair. You took our house, our car, our savings. You left me with furniture and kitchen equipment and a divorce settlement that valued 11 years of my life at exactly zero. And now you're calling because you heard I might have found something valuable and you think you deserve a piece of it. Silence on the other end of the line. Here's what I want you to understand, Garrett. What I found wasn't luck. It was family. It was my grandmother knowing me well enough to leave me exactly what I needed when I needed it. It was my grandfather spending his life preserving something that mattered. It was me choosing to do the right thing instead of the profitable thing. None of that has anything to do with you. Lillian? I'm going to hang up now. Don't call again. Don't contact me. Don't try to find me. We're done. We've been done. And I'm finally okay with that. She ended the call. Her hand was shaking. She set the phone down and stood at the window looking out at the mountains. Colton came in from the porch where he'd been working. Are you okay? Yeah, that was Garrett. What did he want? What he always wanted? More. What did you tell him? Well, I told him no. Colton smiled. Good. That afternoon, they drove down to the town and Lillian opened a bank account. A real account, not the joint account she'd shared with Garrett, an account in her name only. The banker looked at her driver's license and asked for her address. Lillian wrote down the address of the cabin, Rural Route 47, Green Mountains, Vermont. Is this your permanent residence? The banker asked. Lillian thought about the cabin, about the fire and the view and the cellar below where 76 years of patience had finally paid off. About Colton building shelves and Jacob calling with updates and Augustus Whitmore coordinating with museums. About the life she was building piece by piece from what had looked like nothing. Yes, she said, it is. In May, the first sales went through. A portion of the coin collection sold at auction in Philadelphia. The numbers exceeded even the optimistic estimates. 17 coins brought in $412,000. Jacob called that night, excited in a way she'd never heard him. "This is only the beginning," he said. "The stamps will bring more. The books will bring more. We will have enough to do everything we planned and more. How are you feeling?" I feel like my grandparents are watching, like they know that things went to good people, like they can finally rest. The full accounting came through in June. Total value of the sellable portion of the collection $2.9 million. After museum donations and authentication costs, the net proceeds were 2.6 million. Jacobus 50% 1.3 million. Monuments Men Foundation 780,000. Lillian and Colton's 20% 520,000. $260,000 each. The money hit Lillian's account on a Wednesday morning. She sat at the table in the cabin and looked at the number on her phone screen and felt nothing like she'd expected to feel. She didn't feel rich. She didn't feel saved. She felt like someone had handed her tools and it was now her job to build something worth building. She called Colton first. He was in Rutland meeting with a real estate agent looking at properties with workshops. "It came through," she said. "I know, I'm looking at it right now." "How do you feel?" "Scared, grateful, like I've been given a second chance and I better not screw it up." "You won't." "How do you know?" "Because I've watched you work for 6 months. You don't screw things up, you fix them." She heard him take a breath. "Thank you for calling Jacob, for cutting me in, for giving me a chance when you didn't have to. We're family. That's what family does." She called Margot next. "It's done," Lillian said. "The money came through." Margot was quiet for a moment. "Then how much?" 260,000. "Oh my God, yeah. What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet, but I'm going to figure it out. And Margot, I'm going to pay you back for the couch and the car and the groceries and everything you did when I had nothing. You don't have to do that." "I know, but I'm going to anyway because that's what family does." In July, Jacob returned to Vermont. He came with Daniel and with his daughter Rebecca and her 2 children. They stayed at a bed and breakfast in town and visited the cabin every day for a week. Jacob sat on the porch and looked at the mountains and told stories about Vienna. Rebecca asked questions about Stefan and Anna, taking notes for the family history she was compiling. The grandchildren ran through the woods and played by the creek and learned that they came from people who had built beautiful things. On the last day, Jacob asked to go down to the cellar one more time. It was emptier now. Most of the collection had been removed for sale or donation. Only a few items remained, things Jacob had asked to keep, things that would go to his family rather than to museums or auction houses. He stood in the nearly empty room and looked around. "This was a good place," he said. "Your grandparents chose well." "I think so too. Will you stay here in the cabin?" "For now, maybe forever. I haven't decided yet." "Whatever you decide, I hope you will remember what this place represents. Not just the collection, not just the money, but the idea that things can be preserved, that patience matters, that doing right by people, even people you never met, is its own reward." "I'll remember." He turned to her. "I have something for you." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound book. This was my grandmother's journal. She kept it from 1935 to 1938. It is in German, but I have translated portions. Here he opened to a market page. She wrote this in October 1938, just before they packed the crates. She wrote, "We are sending our treasures away, not to save their monetary value, but to save their memory. These coins, these stamps, these books, each one is a story. Each one is proof that we lived, that we loved, that we built something. If anyone finds these someday, please know we were here, we mattered, we will not be forgotten." He closed the book and held it out to Lillian. "I want you to have this." "I can't take your grandmother's journal." "You can and you will, because you are the one who made sure she was not forgotten. You are the one who proved that her treasures carried her memory forward. You are the answer to her prayer." Lillian took the journal with shaking hands. Thank you. Thank you for everything. They climbed back up into the cabin. That night, the whole group had dinner together at the cabin. Colton cooked. He'd gotten good at working with the wood stove, and they ate around the table, and Jacob told more stories, and Rebecca took more notes, and the children asked if they could come back next year. Yes, Jacob said, we will make this a tradition. We will come every summer, and we will remember where our family story continued, where it was saved. After they left, Lillian sat on the porch as the sun set over the mountains. She opened Anna Steiner's journal and read the entries, slowly working through the German with a translation app on her phone. Anna had written about daily life in Vienna, about customers at the bookshop, about Stefan's excitement when he acquired a new coin, about concerts and cafes and walks along the Danube, about the slow creep of fear as the Nazis took power, about friends who left and friends who stayed, about the night they decided to pack what they could and send it away and hope. The last entry was dated November 10th, 1938, the day after Kristallnacht. Our shop is destroyed, the windows broken, the books burned in the street. They came with clubs and fire, and they destroyed 40 years of work in one night. Stefan is heartbroken. I am heartbroken. But the crates are safe. We sent them yesterday with Herr Mueller, who promised to hide them. If they survive, if anyone finds them, please know this was a life. These things represented joy and beauty and the belief that the world could be a better place. We will not live to see that better place. But perhaps these things will. Perhaps someone will find them and understand what they meant. Perhaps someone will care. Lillian closed the journal and sat with it in her lap as the light faded and the stars came out. Someone had cared. Theodore had cared enough to save them. Rosie had cared enough to preserve them. Lillian had cared enough to return them. And now they had made their way back to Jacob, to Rebecca, to the grandchildren who would grow up knowing that their family had mattered, that their family had built beautiful things, that their family story hadn't ended in the camps, but had continued forward through the careful stewardship of strangers who became friends. In August, Lillian hired a contractor to build a small addition to the cabin. Not much, just a room with proper insulation and windows and space for a desk where she could write. The contractor was a local woman named Sarah, who'd been building in Vermont for 30 years. What are you going to use it for? Sarah asked. I'm writing a book about my grandparents and the collection and what it means to inherit things that aren't yours. Sounds like a good book? I hope so. The addition took 6 weeks to build. Colton helped with the finish work. By the end of September, Lillian had a writing room with a view of the mountains and a wood stove and shelves for the research materials she'd been accumulating. She wrote every morning. The story of Theodore and the warehouse in Munich, the story of Rosie maintaining the collection, the story of Jacob searching for his family's things for 70 years, the story of Lillian finding them and choosing to return them. In October, a magazine published her long-form piece about the restitution. It was picked up by news sites and shared thousands of times. People wrote to her, other families looking for lost property, other people who'd found things they didn't know what to do with, other quiet stewards of other people's histories. She answered every letter. In November, 1 year after she'd arrived at the cabin with $47 and a borrowed car, Lillian drove down to town to meet Colton. He'd bought a house, a small Cape Cod with a 2-car garage he was converting into a workshop. He gave her a tour, showing her where the table saw would go, where he'd build the finishing room, where he'd eventually teach classes. I'm calling it second chance carpentry, he said, for guys like me. Veterans, people rebuilding, people who need to work with their hands. That's perfect. They drove to the cemetery where his father was buried. Colton had bought a new headstone, simple granite, his father's name and dates, and below that, beloved father, kept faith, remembered. Colton stood there for a long time, his scarred hand resting on top of the stone. I paid it all off, Dad, he said quietly, and every cent you owed, and I bought a house, and I'm going to build something Rosie kept her promise, just took a while to get here. They drove back to the cabin in comfortable silence. That evening, Lillian sat on the porch wrapped in Rosie's old wool coat and watched the sun set over the mountains. Her phone rang. She smiled when she saw the name. Hi, Jacob. Hello, my friend. How are you on this beautiful evening? I'm good, really good. The writing is going well. The cabin is warm. I think I'm finally figuring out what I'm doing. I am glad to hear this. I am calling because Rebecca and I have been discussing the foundation, the one we are establishing with my portion of the proceeds. We would like to name it after your grandparents as well as mine. The Steiner Brennan Foundation for Holocaust Education and Art Preservation. What do you think? Lillian felt tears on her face. I think Theodore and Rosie would be honored. Good, because they deserve to be honored. They were heroes in the quietest way. They saved things when it would have been easier not to. They kept faith when faith was difficult. They passed something forward that mattered. Yeah, they did. You are doing the same, writing this book, telling this story. You are passing it forward. I'm trying. That is all any of us can do. Try and trust that our trying matters. They talked for a while longer about the foundation and the book and the plans for next summer's visit. When they hung up, Lillian sat in the gathering dark and thought about inheritance. She thought it was about objects, about houses and cars and money and the things you could catalog on an asset disclosure form, but it wasn't. It was about the things you couldn't see, the decisions people made in warehouses in Munich, the choices people made about what to preserve and what to pass forward, the trust people placed in the future even when the present was falling apart. It was about honor, about doing right by people you'd never meet, about keeping faith with the dead and the living and everyone in between. She'd inherited $47 and cabin worth one. But she'd also inherited Theodore's courage and Rosie's patience and Jacob's gratitude and Colton's redemption. She'd inherited the chance to do something that mattered, and she'd taken it. The stars were coming out now, bright and sharp in the cold November air. The mountains held their shape against the darkening sky. Inside the cabin, the fire was burning, and the writing room was waiting, and the book was taking shape page by page. Tomorrow she would write more. Tomorrow Colton would come by with questions about the workshop. Tomorrow she would answer more letters from people looking for lost things. But tonight she just sat on the porch of a cabin her grandmother had left her and understood finally what Rosie had meant. This place was for thinking, for understanding that the most valuable things you could inherit weren't things at all. They were chances. Chances to honor the people who came before you, chances to help the people beside you, chances to build something that would outlast you, chances to prove that love and honor and patience mattered more than money ever could. She had $47 when she arrived. She had $250,000 when the sales cleared. But she'd been rich the whole time. She just hadn't known it yet. Now she did. And that she thought as she stood and went inside to the warm cabin and the waiting fire and the life she was building, one careful choice at a time was the inheritance that actually mattered, the one you couldn't spend or sell or lose, the one you carried forward, the one you passed on.